Welcome back to the Morbid Moonlight 31 Days of Halloween, which this year sees us tumble through the weird and wonderful filmography of horror legend Felissa Rose. We're pretty much up to the present day today with a film released just a few months ago called KNIFECORP, written and directed by first-timer Mr. Zach Zorba Gratian, starring, of course, the amazing Kane Hodder, and with appearances from Tiffany Shepis and Felissa Rose. KNIFECORP is quite an interesting film, I guess some of which is down to the fact that it feels quite fresh as opposed to just being a rehash of a set of familiar kind of subgenre tropes. We're introduced to our group of young kind of sort of teenage types who are being given a beautifully awful pep talk from this brilliantly caricatured salesman type. The difference is that this group are being trained in the sale of knives. They're the latest batch of recruits for a company that calls itself KNIFECORP. They're this kind of mismatched bunch of misfits. We get a group of 4 of them breaking off, and this bunch is going to be our lead characters for most of the film, with young Wally Banks, played by Austin Kuhlman, as our central kind of hero figure. So Wally ends up with a short straw as his group of goofball friends try and compete to win just one of those awful kind of sales prizes of a fuck ton of money for getting the highest sales, and he ends up trying to flog his set of knives to the dodgy houses in the neighbourhood, the no soliciting houses, and soon he ends up at the door of Mr. Kane Hodder, who gives off bad vibes to start with before Wally Banks uncovers some very disturbing secrets about the guy himself. I think I'll leave it there because it's not really the kind of film that it would be fair to spoil by going through all the different plot twists. Suffice it to say that it quite often does the unexpected, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Now, a couple of general thoughts first, okay? So number 1, Kane Hodder is incredible here. More often than not, Kane Hodder, the longest-serving Jason Voorhees actor, is called upon to be one of those kind of horror names that low-budget directors shoot for in the hopes of being able to sell a zero-budget film to horror fans just by using his name. Kane Hodder is often called upon to be just this big, menacing brute, as is the case with something like Death House, for example. Truth is, and I mean this as no disrespect because I really like Kane Hodder, he seems like such a nice guy, really cool, but I've seen more films with him where I feel like he just turns up and plays a big nasty than I have films where he's actually called upon, really, to act. I think the danger with casting big names is that you often will just get somebody to do a little something to add flavour to your film, as opposed to actually giving them a big, meaningful part. Again, this isn't me slagging off Kane Hodder. For instance, Felissa Rose isn't called upon to act in this film. She just turns up in a one-scene cameo on the phone as Wally Banks' mother, just as a little bit of fun. But whereas Felissa Rose has got a natural kind of quirky fun side to her that means that when she gets to do smaller parts she often brings her own kind of life and energy and buoyancy to those roles, Kane Hodder, who is seen as a big scary villain for his time under the hockey mask, is often called upon to do parts that don't really call for him to actually use any of his own personality, but just be this big bad prop. Which is a shame, because KNIFECORP is a role where Kane Hodder really gets to actually act, and I think that he is fantastic. And I mean that not in the way of just saying, I love Kane Hodder, therefore everything he's ever in is great, but that he actually does give a tremendously strong performance with a lot more depth to it than I think is obvious on the page. It's definitely up there with me with his hatchet flashback scenes as Kane Hodder's best work, and I hope that at this lofty stage of a long and interesting career, that he gets a lot more chances to play characterful parts like this one. Point number 2, KNIFECORP is very funny, and not necessarily in this kind of really crass, silly, goofy way. It's actually very sharp and subtle and offbeat, and it tends to kind of play it deadpan as opposed to just going for obvious slapstick or gore. Although, it does cover quite a wide variety of tones over the course of its runtime, I've got to say. There's stuff in KNIFECORP that is genuinely really clever and witty. In fact, that opening scene with the young kind of KNIFECORP employees getting fired up by their sales rep has got some of the kind of great satirical energy to it of the film Slacks, the Killer Jeans film, which is by far the best horror comedy of 2021 so far for me, just because it's so kind of acerbic and it takes no prisoners in attacking that really disgusting corporate consumerist bullshit that you get here in KNIFECORP. Point number 3. Characters. I know a lot of people have got a different level of tolerance for this kind of thing, but really scummy, annoying characters can ruin a film for me. And thankfully, I think that KNIFECORP has got a good central cast that play pretty broadly comedic parts, but manage to do so in a way that doesn't necessarily feel like they're all just your basic archetypes. I think, for example, Wally is a very likeable character, and his fellow Blade bandits are just kind of sitcom-y enough that you can accept them as real people when you need to. I'm happy spending time with this group of characters, and every second of their bantering together is squeezed full of funny little nuggets, these kind of subtle little jokes that are framed in this nice, kind of low-key way that tells us that this film has got funny to spare. There's a mysterious oriental dude, for example, whose shtick gets maybe overused a little bit, but when he gets a chance to do less on-the-nose stuff, it's really great. The joke being that he is this kind of cliched amalgamation of what Westerners think that Asian people are like. This kind of mishmash of every single bit of fake Asian stereotypes, even down to the fact that nobody's quite sure of what part of Asia he comes from. I think that the only off-note for me of the characters is Courtney Grant as Raoul, who plays one of the other characters' boyfriends, and whilst the Asian dude, Himson Chang, is a character that kind of plays with stereotypes in a fun, kind of knowing way, whilst also being a cool character in himself, unfortunately Raoul plays his part as the most cliched, over-the-top camp gay man, where the whole joke is, look, he's gay, and to be honest, compared to the other characters, it's a shame that we don't get more than that, because it just feels kind of a little bit lazy just to rely on kind of really basic, overdone stereotype. A quick word about our two cameos as well. First, we have got Felissa Rose, and as this is the 31 Days of Felissa Rose, it's worth pointing out that this is absolutely one of those blink and you will miss her appearances, which means that KNIFECORP gets a tiny little Felissa Rose factor of 1 out of 10, which is a shame, although to be honest, there's not really room for a character to do any more than she does. There's also a fairly brief and funny scene with Tiffany Shepis, who's another well-known horror actress, who plays this kind of predatory housewife for a brief little gag scene. There's a lot of things that I like about KNIFECORP, and I really wanted to say that I loved it. Unfortunately, it's got some problems, most of which come down to the fact that it's very much this film of 3 distinct acts. Act 1, which is all set up, that ends with a very significant event, Act 2, which is more or less going round in circles, and Act 3, which is our kind of finale. Thing is, the first act, the first half hour or so of KNIFECORP, is really, really great. If I was rating this film in chunks, then the first half hour of KNIFECORP, I would say, is a solid 8 out of 10. Really funny in a nice, subtle, acerbic way, not just some kind of mindlessly lowest common denominator stuff like Ugly Sweater Party or something. It's very well written, it's really nicely filmed, and it seems like a film that really knows what it's doing. Kane Hodder is golden in his scenes with Wally Banks, when he's being just kind of low-key menacing in this kind of realistic way. Everything's going really well, then the key plot twist happens at the end of the first act, and it basically punctures this kind of reality of that first act, just because the tone of this world and these characters means that it's hard to deal with something quite so serious, and it's too dark a thing to happen to really be able to mine it for black comedy. The second act, the middle section of the film, which is usually the weakest, to be honest, in most low-budget films, just because a lot of it is moving from setup to punchline, so to speak, is actually okay, although the gags do start to become a little bit cruder. For example, it's here that we get introduced to our really stereotypically gay character, and where that key foursome that we've opened the film with starts to break up a bit, and also where things start to move into more overt horror territory. The middle's fine, but where the first act was really funny and subtle, the middle's kind of a lot more obvious. It starts mixing serious stuff with very obvious comedy, and you start to get this feeling like the two extremes of horror and comedy are pulling in different directions and running the risk of ripping the film itself in half. I'm not sure exactly when I'd say the third act starts, but there's a moment that definitely marks what Americans would call the point where KNIFECORP jumps the shark, and really loses itself by doing something that just punctures the whole film in a way that there's no coming back from. That moment, which I won't spoil, is essentially a really goofy death scene that involves marshmallows. If you've seen KNIFECORP, you'll know what I'm referring to. If you haven't, but you ever plan on watching it, then keep an eye out for those marshmallows, because that's the point when you more or less lose the film. It's just one of those really kind of horribly judged or horribly misjudged ideas that must have seemed like a good idea for a joke at the time, but which just kind of ruins Kane Hodder's character completely by robbing him of all the gravitas and menace that he's had up until this point. Fair enough that a lot of the other characters are doing their own thing, doing very broad comedy, but the one thing that you don't do in a film like this is to let the comedy spill over into areas that have to remain serious. If your villain turns into a joke as well, then you run the risk of turning your film into something like Ugly Sweater Party, where everything is a joke and nothing matters, and good comedy, which a lot of KNIFECORP is, to its credit, and that's why it's so disappointing that it drops the ball at this point, good comedy relies on you being able to tell your characters apart, knowing who everybody is and what they're capable of. If your characters all just smudge together into this kind of general wacky bunch of goons, then there's a danger that everyone on screen just ends up feeling like a collection of bad jokes written by somebody who doesn't have the discipline to craft decent personas for their characters. It feels lazy to me, and good comic characters shouldn't be interchangeable. Sadly as well, after that shark jump of the really silly comedy death scene, things really do end up getting very silly and very messy, because the only way you can go is down. We get another very long comedy death scene that's both kind of really obvious and quite nasty in a way that's really not that funny. Then, the ending itself is just poor and relies upon this really, really overused trope that I'm not going to discuss here, because thinking about it I'd probably spoil the direction that the film's going on. But it's basically the trope that infected superhero films and made me so fed up of them that I gave up, and it's used here and it just feels tired and uninteresting, and I just don't care about it. I mean, that does sound very negative, and it's true that the film is like a long, slow descent down a ski slope that starts off very high, then gradually plunges down and down until you walk away at the end feeling disappointed. Am I glad I watched it? Of course I am, because I did like quite a lot of it. It does some of its best stuff better than a lot of films this year have done, but it's just a shame that it can't sustain that, and it's the biggest shame that this seems to be a film that, in trying to think of stuff to happen to keep it all interesting, it kind of loses sight of the boundaries of what would and what wouldn't work within the reality of this film, and it just kind of enters slightly generic running around the scary house territory by the end, as well as having some pretty desperate stuff in it that's not necessarily stuff that's really awful in itself, but is sad because it's stuff that ruins what came before it. You know, I get quite wound up by films that start off really great then disappoint me, because at least with something like Ugly Sweater Party, you know within 2 minutes that it's a crude, ugly, cynical piece of shit, and you'd be right, and it remains that all the way through. With a film like KNIFECORP, some of it's really good, but it would be hard to watch it again knowing that it doesn't amount to anything. I think for a one-off watch, because I think Kane Hodder's great, and because it's more of a comedy than a horror, which means that thinking seriously about what works in the story and whether it makes sense tonally or not are less important than a simple "did you have a good time?" I'm going to come in at 6 out of 10 for KNIFECORP. Any higher, and I couldn't reconcile some of the things I really didn't like about it. Any lower, and it would be unfair to the stuff that I really liked in it. I'd say it's worth a watch. Maybe your tastes are very different to mine, I don't know. But that should be a wrap on day number 24 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose, an unusually long one here, but I think it is a pretty interesting film to look at. I hope that you enjoyed, and we'll catch you back here tomorrow for some more Felissa Rose goodness. Finally getting into our last week of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. Give us a like, give us a comment, whatever, and we shall see you in the next one. Alright?